Welcome to Book Nook, where I read books so you don't have to. Climate change is the hot topic of debate these days, with a huge range of opinions. Everything from, we only have 6 years to fix it or we're doomed, to, it's a hoax that benefits China. So I'm looking at How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates, one of the world's most controversial people. I will try to give my objective take on what's good and what's bad about this book, but first I need to disclose my personal bias. When I first learned Gates had written How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, my reaction was to laugh. Why? Well, in Bill's own words.
Yeah, I'd probably have one of the highest greenhouse gas footprints of anyone on the planet. My
kind of ironic.
personal flying alone is gigantic.
In the introduction, Gates admits, I'm aware that I'm an imperfect messenger on climate change. My carbon footprint is absurdly high. He makes a further disclosure that in 2015, he started the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which by 2020 was invested in 40 startup companies working on low-carbon products. Supporters will say he's putting his money where his mouth is, while critics will call Gates a grifter who is spreading fear of climate disaster to sell more products and get huge government grants to research more money-making products. You can decide if he's a prophet of the apocalypse or he just wants to profit from belief in the apocalypse. In Chapter 1, Gates explains that carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere, resulting in global warming. To him, reducing carbon emissions isn't enough. We need net zero, giving the analogy of a bathtub. When filling a tub, if you turn the flow down to a trickle, rather than shutting it off completely, eventually it will overflow anyway. Now, Gates has no formal background in climate science. He's a college dropout in computer science, so some of his claims are questionable. He claims temperatures will rise by up to 8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, but gives no footnotes where he got this number. Earlier, he'd mentioned the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but they weren't predicting anything close to 8 degrees. In fact, he says IPCC reports acknowledge up front some uncertainty about how much and how quickly the temperature will go up, and adds that computer models are far from perfect. The climate is mind-blowingly complex, and there's a lot we don't understand. Gates raises the alarm bells on climate change, which will certainly scare the uninformed reader. For example, claiming global warming will cause the death rate to rise. Actually, this claim was refuted by Bjorn Lomborg, with data over the last century showing deaths from climate disasters dropping more than 90%, and deaths due to cold outnumbering deaths from heat 9-1. In fact, global warming would lower the number of deaths. Another interesting claim is that 2 to 10% of the adult population of Mexico will move to the US by 2080 due to climate change. In the Biden years, 2% of the population of Mexico moved to the US every year, and it had nothing to do with climate. Gates claims the drought in Syria was 3 times worse because of climate change. This contradicts what he said earlier. We can't with certainty blame climate change for any particular event. Gates predicts a 2-foot rise in sea levels in Miami by 2100, but doesn't say how much of this is due to climate change, or how much because the land in Miami is sinking. In fact, sea level has been rising since the end of the Ice Age, thousands of years ago. But at least Gates didn't repeat Al Gore's insane claims of a rapid 20-foot rise in sea level. Gates also claims global warming will reduce crop yields, causing a 20% increase in food prices. In my view, government policies to fight climate change threaten to cut farm yields more than climate change itself. The fertilizer ban in Sri Lanka in 2021 cut yields by 50%, and plans to force a third of Dutch farmers off their lands would reduce yields by a third. Further, Gates ignores reports from NASA that the excess carbon dioxide is greening the planet. I'll cover Gates' ideas about agriculture later in the podcast. Another fearful prediction is that storms and wildfires will get worse. Again, he doesn't cite any sources for these predictions. Since there's already been global warming and constant increases in CO2 since pre-industrial times, you might expect the frequency of hurricanes and fires would be much higher today. But data doesn't support that. Hurricanes are the same or less than they were a century ago, and the wildfires peaked during the heat waves of the 1930s, when CO2 was much lower. Gates says California wildfires will be 5 times as common as they were in the 1970s, but fails to tell a reader that burn acreage in the 70s was down 90% from its 1930s peak. So even 5-time increase from the 70s would still bring the number to about half the level of 90 years ago, when CO2 was lower. Gates puts two charts side by side to illustrate that global average temperatures are rising along with emissions. To the untrained eye, they look impressive, with similar dramatic upward slopes suggesting a close correlation. A closer look reveals the illusion. One chart shows temperature change rather than the actual temperature. So the entire upward move was only 1.2 degrees Celsius from 1850 to 2018. And that move only looks dramatic because 168 years of data are squished into a graph only an inch and a half wide. It's so small it's hard to see there was a cooling trend from the 1940s to the 1970s, so strong that the scientists were predicting a new ice age despite annual increases in CO2. And of that 1.2 degree rise, there's no information how much of that increase was due to solar activity or natural cycles or urban heat effect. Concrete buildings, parking lots, and airport runways absorb lots of heat. But Gates' graphs put all the blame on CO2. The CO2 chart shows man-made emissions rising from 0 to 37 billion. But as 97% of emissions are natural, a chart purporting to show that CO2 causes warming should show the actual CO2 in the atmosphere. That chart would show an increase from about 300 parts per million in 1850 to 410 in 2018. That's roughly from 0.03% of the atmosphere to 0.04% in 168 years. That chart wouldn't be so impressive. By starting the graphs at 1850, Gates ignores other warming periods long before fossil fuels were burnt, like the medieval warm period when Vikings farmed the coast of Greenland, and some centuries of the Roman Empire. Chapter 2. This will be hard. This is Bill's best chapter. He reminds activists of the pervasiveness of fossil fuels. Your breakfast depends on fossil fuels as your cereal required fertilizer to grow and tractors to farm. Then you brush your teeth with a plastic toothbrush made from fossil fuels. You have a burger at lunch, and there are emissions to get the beef and more emissions to make the bun. You wear clothes made from cotton, which needs emissions, or polyester, which comes from fossil fuels. You use toilet paper. There are emissions when the trees are cut down. You come home from work on the train on tracks of cement and iron, which need fossil fuels to produce. Or you come by car or bus, there are required emissions to produce the steel and plastic to build them, and they run on cement roads requiring emissions and asphalt from petroleum. And even if you have an electric car, it might be charged from coal or gas-powered plants. Even as the world attempts to decarbonize, Gates points out that we must release greenhouse gases to build wind turbines, solar panels, electricity storage systems, and nuclear plants. As a further downer, Gates notes that oil demand is still rising, and poor countries will consume more as they develop. It would be immoral and impractical to try to stop people who are lower down on the economic ladder from climbing up. We can't expect poor people to stay poor because rich countries emitted too many greenhouse gases. So the chapter is a good lesson for activists like Just Stop Oil and Greta Thunberg, who advocate immediate stop to fossil fuels. It's a stupid plan that would collapse the economy and result in mass starvation and poverty. Sadly, in the few years since the book was written, the activists have become more aggressive and less realistic. While Gates argues it will be hard to get to net zero by 2050, since the necessary technology to do so hasn't been invented yet, politicians and activists are speeding up. There's UN Agenda 2030 and plans to force people to switch to buying electric cars rather than gasoline cars by 2035, even before the grid is expanded to be able to charge all those extra cars. Chapter 3 is the 5 questions to ask in every climate conversation. Number 1, how much of the 51 billion tons are we talking about? Number 2, what's your plan for cement? Number 3, how much power are we talking about? Number 4, how much space do you need? And number 5, how much is this going to cost? The point of question 1 is that you need to eliminate 51 billion tons of emissions to get to zero, as some measures are pointless. He gives the example of a cap and trade system in Europe that supposedly cut emissions by 17 million tons. Sounds impressive, but do the math, and that's only 0.03%. So Bill concentrates on technologies that can reduce emissions by at least 1%, which is more than 500 million tons a year. What's your plan for cement? Sounds strange, but it's a great question. Gates figures making things, cement, steel, plastic, accounts for 31% of emissions. Cement production alone has more emissions than passenger car exhaust, so it's hard to get to net zero without a plan for cement. How much space do you need? Gates asks how much power we could generate per square meter and gives these answers. Fossil fuels, 500 to 10,000 watts per square meter. Nuclear, 500 to 1,000. Solar, 5 to 20. Hydropower, like dams, 5 to 50. Wind, 1 to 2. And wood and other biomass, less than 1. He says if you want to use wind instead of solar, you'll need more land. All other things being equal, this doesn't mean that wind is bad and solar is good. It just means they have different requirements that should be part of the conversation. Actually, he's wrong. Wind really is bad. The obvious conclusion from the chart is that the best way to replace fossil fuels is with nuclear. In fact, Bill said as much in his own TED Talk from 2010. Michael Schellenberger uses similar stats in Apocalypse Never, which I cover in a separate podcast. Schellenberger is big on nuclear, since wind and solar require hundreds of times more land. There isn't enough land, especially when you need to triple the current output from the power grid to power factories and electric cars. You need to cover forests, farms, and animal habitat. And in some poor areas where the main source of energy is wood, Schellenberger says fossil fuels would benefit the environment by ending the need for deforestation of trees that absorbs CO2. How much is this going to cost? Here Gates introduces the concept of the green premium. Basically, how much more do you have to spend to buy a lower carbon product? His idea is that people should now deploy existing technologies with low green premiums, and then research and development should be focused on products where the green premium is highest, like cement. If there currently is no green option for a product, producers can still get to net zero by carbon capture to offset their emissions. Gates estimates the current cost of direct air capture, which is sucking CO2 out of the air and burying it, is about $200 per ton. And he hopes technology can eventually lower this to $100. At that price, it would take $5.1 trillion a year to net out 51 billion tons of CO2. Gates doesn't say where you would bury 51 billion tons a year, or how you would stop it from leaking out, what that CO2 would do to the environment while underground, or how much energy this operation would take. Chapter 4, how we plug in. 27% of 51 billion tons per year. Gates makes a good case for nuclear. It's the only carbon-free energy source that can reliably deliver power day and night through every season, almost everywhere on Earth, that has been proven to work on a large scale. He goes on to say, and it's hard to foresee a future where we decarbonize our power grid affordably without using more nuclear power. He introduces his own company, TerraPower, which at the time was designing a new type of nuclear reactor that would have several advantages over existing designs. Unfortunately, he spends more space in the chapter discussing solar and wind. Just to be clear, variable energy sources like solar and wind can play a substantial role getting us to zero. In fact, we need them too. He gives the example of Germany that produces 10 times more solar energy in July than it does in December. So much that it needs to offload the excess on Poland. So he deals with possible solutions to that variability. So he describes how the US should build a national grid, so when some states are producing too much solar or wind energy, they can sell it to states with less sunshine or wind. He goes into the economics of battery storage. I've lost a lot more money on startup battery companies than I could have imagined. He calculates how many batteries it would take to power Tokyo for 3 days. Answer? 14 million batteries for $400 billion, plus installation, maintenance, and interest. Then there's pumped hydro. Pump water up a hill when power is cheap, so you can release the water later when you need more hydro. Then there's thermal storage. His TerraPower company is working on the technology to store excess heat in molten salt and convert that into electricity when the sun goes down. And then there's hydrogen. Use electricity to pull hydrogen from water when you have surplus power, and use hydrogen to power the turbines when you don't. Bill touches on a few other topics in the chapter. On the issue of nuclear fusion research, he quotes the old joke, "Fusion is 40 years away, and always will be." He likes offshore wind and praises the government subsidies in the UK and wind investments in China. But before you support offshore wind, I suggest you check out the documentary Thrown to the Wind, showing how wind farms destroy whale habitat. Gates likes geothermal and wants more research, but notes some problems that limit its possibilities. Under the heading Other Innovations, he mentions carbon capture, like running the gas plants and just capture the carbon dioxide exhaust before it gets into the atmosphere. And his other innovation is using less, which was a new idea for Bill. Chapter 5, How We Make Things. 31% of 51 billion tons. The biggest challenge of net zero is how we make things. Huge emissions making cement, steel, plastic, fertilizer, glass, paper, aluminum, etc. Bill gives some stats. Every year, Americans produce 96 million tons of cement. That's nearly 600 pounds for every person in the country. And it's also 600 pounds per person for steel. And making a ton of steel produces about 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. Bill gives a few theoretically possible solutions. One is to use plastic as a carbon sink. Since plastic chemically is mostly carbon, if you were to suck carbon out of the air and then use that carbon to make solid plastic, you lower the greenhouse effect, assuming your energy source at the plastic factory was zero emissions. Then there was the idea of capturing CO2 from making cement and injecting it back into the cement, or making cement out of seawater and captured carbon. As Bill doesn't find these solutions likely, his plan for making materials is 1. Electrify everything, like using electricity for heat rather than coal or gas. 2. Get that electricity from zero carbon energy, like solar. And 3. Then use carbon capture to offset the emissions created in the process. And 4. Use materials more efficiently. Chapter 6, How We Grow Things. 16% of 51 billion tons. Even people who fully believe the climate change narrative should strongly object to Gates' chapter on growing things. Surely if we want to cut emissions, the last thing we should do is cut food production. It should be obvious that hunger and starvation are terrible, yet leaders continue to push anti-food policies. We had a humanitarian disaster in Sri Lanka after the fertilizer ban, and yet groups like the European Commission still push for fertilizer limits, smaller livestock production, and even kicking farmers off their farms. What these eco-extremists ignore is that farms are actually carbon sinks. Crops grow by photosynthesis. They suck carbon dioxide out of the air. The European Union isn't going to save the planet by kicking Dutch farmers off their land and paving over it for real estate developers. Chapter 6 takes aim at farm animals. Around the world, there are roughly 1 billion cattle raised for beef and dairy. The methane they burp and fart out every year has the same warming effect as 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide, accounting for about 4% of global emissions. Bill's issue is that these cow emissions come out as methane, chemically CH4, which he says on page 113 creates 28 times more warming per molecule than CO2. Although on page 21 he says it's 120 times worse. No footnotes. I would be entertained to learn why he believes one carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms would hold 120 times more heat than a carbon atom with 2 oxygen atoms. Scientists still can't tell you exactly how much global warming is caused by a CO2 molecule. And that's why the climate models have told us for 40 years that we only have 10 years left. So I don't know how they could claim with any confidence that methane is 120 times or even 28 times worse. And Bill rants about animal poop, which releases nitrous oxide, which he says is 265 times worse, again without any explanation. Bill writes about the possible technological solutions to fight cowbirds. They've tried using vaccines to cut down on the methogenetic microbes living in the cattle's gut, breeding cattle to naturally produce fewer emissions, and adding special feed or drugs to their diets. As if we need more drugs and chemicals in our food. These efforts have been mostly unsuccessful. After the book was written, Bill himself was funding his own research into vaccines to reduce cow farts. You can't make this up. As a remedy to cows, Bill proposes fake meats and admits his bias because he's a major investor in Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. Climate profit. At the time, fake meat was 86% more expensive than the real stuff. A bill hopes the green premium would eventually drop, but I wouldn't recommend it at any price. The Impossible Burger is made with genetically modified Roundup sprayed soya, leading to massive ecological devastation. Total levels of glyphosate were 11.3 parts per billion, when only 0.1 parts per billion can destroy gut bacteria, damage liver and kidneys, cause reproductive abnormalities, or even tumor. Another possibility is cell-based meat. Meat cells are cultivated in a lab. All of this can be done with little or no greenhouse gas emissions, aside from the electricity you need to power the labs where the process is done. It wasn't on the market when the book was written, but it's out now. It just takes so much more energy than expected. The greenhouse gas emissions are ridiculous. Another solution is just to waste less food. 2 companies are working on invisible, plant-based coatings that extend the shelf life of fruits and vegetables. And at least one of those 2 companies is owned by Bill Gates himself. Surprise! And the company is called Appeal. Its produce is now in stores, and YouTube is flooded with videos from doctors and consumer advocates warning of the health risks. It's made from 2 different chemical solvents, and the scariest part is that it can't be rubbed off or washed out. You can't eat those fruits and vegetables without eating Bill's chemicals. The videos recommend you contact your local grocery store manager to learn if their produce contains Appeal. How we grow things also deals with deforestation, which he says is bad because it disturbs the soil, releasing more CO2. We see why he should have promoted nuclear more than wind and solar, which requires hundreds of times more land and will result in deforestation to scale up. In the book, Bill is not a fan of planting trees, calculating some minor benefits in the tropics, but saying between the tropics and the polar circles, trees don't help net zero because they block snow so they absorb heat rather than reflect it. Again, no citation or footnote. So Bill's biggest idea here is for rich countries to pay poor countries to keep the forests that they already have. After the book, Gates became even more anti-tree. Asked if planting trees could fight climate change, he said,
I don't plant trees. I mean, are we the science people or are we the idiots? Which one do we want to be?
Chapter 7, How We Get Around. 16% of 51 billion tons a year. There's plenty of bad news for net zero in the chapter on transportation. Gasoline is 35 times as powerful as batteries by weight. So to have electric garbage trucks, buses, and 18-wheelers, you need batteries that are just too heavy. For example, an electric cargo truck with a battery big enough to go 600 miles on a single charge would need to carry 25% less cargo than a diesel truck of the same size. Jets are worse. A takeoff jet fuel is 20 to 40% of the weight of the jet. So we can't replace that fuel with a battery weighing 35 times as much. Barring some unlikely breakthrough, batteries will never be light and powerful enough to move planes and ships anything more than short distances. Biofuels have possibilities, but Gates rightly says that growing corn for ethanol doesn't make sense, as that land is needed for food. He suggests switchgrass, since nobody was going to eat that, or biofuel from farm residue, byproducts of paper production, and food waste. But it's hard to do. A bill said he already lost $50 million on a biofuels company. Hydrogen is also problematic. With enough electricity, you can separate hydrogen from water. But if that electricity comes from a natural gas plant, you might as well choose gas over hydrogen. A technology that uses microbes to produce hydrogen would also be awesome. Another wild idea is to make hydrocarbon fuels, getting the hydrogen from electrolysis and the carbon from CO2 captured from the atmosphere. Sounds like science fiction. So Bill muses maybe we need nuclear-powered container ships. Chapter 8, How We Keep Cool and Stay Warm. 7% of 51 billion tons a year. The plan here calls for electrifying what we can, like replacing furnaces with electric heat pumps. And then we need more clean energy, so those clean heat pumps aren't run on coal-fired electricity. And he calls for tougher regulations that will promote green building. More insulation, triple glazed windows, efficient doors, and smart glass that tints when it's brighter. Chapter 9, Adapting to a Warmer World. Bill talks about meeting a family in Kenya that lived in mud huts with thatched roofs and farmed a plot of land smaller than a baseball field. They own 1 cow. They sell half the milk, leaving 1.5 liters a day for their family of 5 to drink. Then they catch a break, which allows them to buy 3 more cows, at which point they earn $4 a day selling milk, after which Bill says this gem. But if you remember the problems with cattle that I mentioned in chapter 6, you'll recognize the dilemma right away. The Talams bought more cattle, and cattle contribute more to climate change than any other livestock. Wow! Bill owns 4 private jets, and he says it is a dilemma for a family in a mud hut to own 4 cows. It's all about those cow farts.
Yeah, I'd probably have one of the highest greenhouse gas footprints of anyone on the planet. My
kind of ironic.
personal flying alone is gigantic.
Then there's more fear mongering. He says when, as is likely, we hit 2 degrees Celsius of warming, most of the coral reefs in the world will die off. But the data says the reverse. The Great Barrier Reef has record growth with the warming we've had. Corals do fine with CO2. They evolved 500 million years ago when CO2 concentrations were 1,500% higher. As the climate gets warmer, droughts and floods will become more frequent. The air and soil lose moisture. But again, the data is showing no increased droughts. The world is greener, and if anything, it's a little wetter now compared to when it was a degree cooler. Bill hopes to save the Kenyan farmers from themselves by a combination of technology and government intervention based on the climate models of the day. He recommends drones and sensors to check the fields, and smartphone apps that will identify pests and plant diseases. That sounds out of touch where people earn $4 a day. I guess they would be supplied by corporations funded by Western governments. He wants to develop new seeds for climate-resistant strains and have climate-smart crops and livestock. Agricultural researchers will need more money, presumably American biotech companies. To me, it sounds like what Obianuju Ekiocho calls neocolonialism in her book Target Africa, which I cover in a separate podcast. Western governments and NGOs tell the Africans what to grow, what seeds to plant, what animals they can own, all based on the current climate narrative of Western policymakers. And no, you can't have tractors and fertilizer like Bill Gates has on his farms. That's not sustainable. Gates ends the chapter debating geoengineering, calling it a break glass in case of emergency type thing. There's the idea of brightening clouds by using a salt spray that causes more light. Gates even funds experiments that distribute particles in the upper layers of the atmosphere to reflect light back into space. He's been ridiculed for this. Seems strange to artificially change the climate to fight climate change, and there could be unintended consequences. But mostly, Gates resembles Mr. Burns on the Simpsons episode where he blocks the sun. Gates doesn't mention in the book that this plan would require thousands of planes, and Gates is a partner in an aircraft leasing company, which, last time I checked, had a rewards points program for buying aviation fuel. The more you burn, the more you earn.
How dare you!
Chapter 10, Why Government Policies Matter, and Chapter 11, A Plan for Getting to Zero, call for massive, risky research and development to be paid by governments. In general, the government's role is to invest in R&D when the private sector won't, because it can't see how it will make a profit. It might be a big breakthrough, but it might be a bust, so we'll need to tolerate some outright failures. Bill gives his wish list for technologies needed, including many he described earlier in the book as being unlikely or unpractical. He reminds us that the government has been burned by investing in clean energy before. Look up cylinder scandal if you need a reminder. So I did. In 2009, the cylinder company, of which an Obama fundraiser was the largest shareholder, got a $535 million loan guarantee as part of Obama's Green Initiative. The company soon went bust. All that money was lost. Fraud investigation, big scam. The bill fails to tell us that there were other billionaire Obama donors who received money from the same program. Government spending only starts with research grants. Gates wants governments to use their procurement power, using their own money to buy all the green alternatives available. For example, buying low-carbon fuels for military planes and ships. Many cities are already following this advice by replacing buses, fire trucks, and even ambulances with electric vehicles that are more expensive and less reliable. Every bureaucrat who makes purchasing decisions should have an incentive to look for green products. This is just corruption. You never want bureaucrats getting richer by spending your money, and spend they will. Gates calls for incentives like tax credits and loan guarantees for private sector purchases. And government will pay for infrastructure to get new technologies to market. For example, new transmission lines, since we need to more than triple the amount of power in just a few decades. Then there's the pipelines for transporting captured carbon to the storage locations. How much expensive steel will that take? And of course, charging stations. Here's the story of a $7.5 billion government program that produced only 8 charging stations in 2.5 years. Lots of grants to people who didn't do anything positive with the money. In Canada, there was a green program that got cancelled after wasting $1 billion on projects with no evidence they would lower emissions, 90 cases of illegal conflicts of interest, and corruption in UK green energy. And Gates actually wants to reward bureaucrats for self-dealing. Gates also wants governments to shrink the green premiums by subsidizing the expensive green alternatives while simultaneously raising carbon taxes on the cheaper ones. He grapples with what to do with the money raised from carbon taxes. You can't just give tax rebates because the people could afford to buy those products, so they won't cut back. Eventually, the carbon price could be set at the cost of direct air capture, and the revenues could be used to pay for pulling carbon out of the air. So this is literally taking your tax dollars and stuffing them down a sinkhole. And no surprise, Bill Gates is the world leader in direct air capture. And I'm not aware of anyone who's investing more in direct air capture technologies. Chapter 12, What Each of Us Can Do. As a citizen, Bill wants people to become activists for climate change. Attending town halls, writing letters, and making calls, creating pressure that encourages politicians to make the tough choices and trade-offs necessary to deliver on their promises to reduce emissions. Those unnamed trade-offs would of course be higher taxes, less spending on other government services, and less personal freedom. As a consumer, he lists some tips to reduce your home's emissions. Using LED lights, smart thermostats, efficient appliances, having good insulation, and replacing your heating and cooling with an electric heat pump. There's nothing about private jets, super yachts, or building super mansions. Though he does want you to try his plant-based burgers and dairy products. But reducing your own carbon footprint isn't the most powerful thing you can do. Spoken like a true hypocrite. Don't make any personal sacrifices, just badger other people to sacrifice. Gates wants people to sign up for green pricing programs for electricity in places that have them, voluntarily paying more to make a market signal for net zero. He calls on people to buy EVs, even if they would need to charge them with electricity coming from fossil fuels. It gives EV companies money to ramp up for the future in which drivers could charge up with carbon-free fuel. And again, the point is to make a market signal. And that's strange since a year later, Gates sold short Tesla stock, betting $500 million the company was overvalued and hoping to profit from a stock price collapse. As an employee or employer, Bill suggests planting trees as an offset, forgetting that he already said that didn't help. Bill says companies should be accepting more risk, for example, financing projects that might fail, but might turn into a clean energy breakthrough. Companies and their leaders need to be rewarded for making bets. As well, he wants companies to set up an internal carbon tax, prioritize innovation in low-carbon solutions, and advise governments on R&D programs that might turn into green products, which basically means lobbying governments to fund R&D that will help the company. Afterword, climate change and COVID-19. Gates destroys what little credibility he had in his afterword. During the pandemic, Gates jetted the world making pronouncements for the World Health Organization, as if he were the top doctor in charge of pandemic response. By reminding the reader of COVID, he signals to the reader that when he was writing the book, he really didn't have a lot of time to carefully research or think about the topic. He starts off by praising the election of Joe Biden in 2020 and lauds China for signing on to net zero. He panders to minorities by lamenting that blacks and Latinx suffered more from COVID than whites. And he attacks people that didn't like wearing masks. At the time of writing, There were already dozens of scientific studies showing that masks didn't prevent the spread. Now there are hundreds of such studies. So much for following the science. It's all completely irrelevant, unless the book was written as a political statement rather than an attempt to inform. Gates wants to tap into the people who supported masks and lockdowns and sign them up for his net zero crusade. And he'll maybe sell a few more fake burgers. For a different approach to climate change, check out my podcast about Michael Schellenberger's Apocalypse Never, a book with loads of real research where the author doesn't throw people under the electric bus for some hypothetical emission reduction or personal profit.